as far as from an economic standpoint, the South was totally dependent upon slavery for not just cotton, but rice, indigo, all of those different crops that were coming out of there. And the South was heavily involved in exporting those to places like England and France and other places, to industrialized nations that could use those. So economically, it was totally a necessity. There were times when slavery was diminishing in the South, but there were also times, for instance, when the cotton gin came in, which helped to process cotton, that made it a lot more practical to have more people. Today, we use machines to do the work that hands used to do. So the more hands you had, the more work you get done, the better your economy was, okay? And so blacks were sold by their own tribal members from Africa, brought over here, enslaved, fairly expensive to purchase a slave. I mean, it was a business operation. Now to the North wasn't in love with blacks either, but they didn't like the slavery aspect of it. And so you have that contention. If you're familiar with Andrew Jackson and what went on with South Carolina in the 1830, I think it was 1833, South Carolina almost backed out of the Union because they thought that they, as a state, had a right to have slavery and so forth. So it becomes an issue of states' rights. In a sense, that's kind of what's going on today with sanctuary cities in California. The president saying it's got to be this way, Department of Justice saying it's got to be this way, and you've got a state that's saying we can do whatever we want. In fact, if we don't want to do anything, we don't have to. So it was that kind of environment, except much more charged than we are today, but it's still that issue. So in a political sense, slavery became kind of the ball that's being batted around on both sides of the court, and it becomes the big item of discussion politically. So it was a very, very dangerous time, and it would do nothing but increase. I mean, you have to really get in and read the documents. You've got to read the letters. You've got to read, announcements and so forth. So I'm going to give you my impression of this, okay? So as far as the members of the church, there were those who came from the South that owned slaves. There were some who were in the West that owned slaves. And there was no effort by the church to say, you can't do that. Now later when Brigham Young gets up here and Utes are selling Paiutes as slaves and so forth, he took a stand against that. But there were those who came from back east, whether we're talking about Nauvoo or even further east, who came and brought their slaves to Utah. And they had their slaves, and there was nothing said. It wasn't like you can't do that. You have to realize also that when you talk about this, one of the things that LDS people say is that they are going to follow the laws of the land. And so the laws of the land were constantly shifting as territories were created, and then the territories became states. And then when those states came in, the question is it going to be free or is it going to be slave? So when people came out here, they knew pretty much that they weren't going to have slaves. If you already had a slave and you brought that slave with you, well, maybe maybe so, and that's what the Dred Scott decision was about, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that was one of the big questions. Is a slave property? So if I can take my suitcase from one state to another and not be challenged, why can't I take a slave, which is my property, which I paid for, with me into that state? And so that was part of the questioning that was going on. In Utah, as it gets going as a territory, that there were a handful of people who came to Utah who had slaves, who were, black slaves and so forth. And it was accepted. There wasn't any, you can't do that. So we'll just say it was accepted. But they're following the laws of the land.